Welcome to Mr. Night Media.
Several nurses at a small hospital in Texas reported seeing a shadowy figure lurking in the intensive care unit, ICU. This shadow always appeared near the rooms of terminally ill patients just before they passed away, leading some to believe it was a harbinger of death. The ICU of St. Mary's Hospital in rural Texas was known for its quiet, somber atmosphere. The hospital, built in the late 1970s, had seen its share of death, life-saving miracles, and mysteries. By the early 2000s, the night shift nurses began experiencing something unsettling that would haunt them for years to come. Emily, a nurse with over a decade of experience, was among the first to witness what she would later call the grim visitor. It was a particularly quiet night, the kind of night where the soft hum of ventilators and heart monitors mixed with the distant clicks of keyboards in the nurse's station. There was no warning, no premonition. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until she saw it. Emily was doing her rounds around 3 a.m., the fabled witching hour, when the air in the hospital always seemed just a little bit colder. She was checking on an elderly patient, Mr. Hawkins, who was in critical condition after a massive stroke. As she stood by the bed, writing notes on his chart, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. At the far end of the room near the door, a figure stood motionless. At first, she assumed it was one of her colleagues, but when she turned to look directly, the figure didn't move. It wasn't a person, at least not entirely. The shape was shadowy, almost formless, but vaguely human in stature. It stood there as if observing Mr. Hawkins, cloaked in darkness, its features impossible to make out. Emily blinked, rubbing her tired eyes, thinking perhaps exhaustion was playing tricks on her. But when she looked again, the shadow remained. The air around her grew heavier, colder, and she felt an inexplicable sense of dread crawl down her spine. Before she could react, the heart monitor next to Mr. Hawkins emitted a single long, piercing beep. Flatline. Emily rushed to his side, trying to revive him, but it was too late. The man had passed away, silently and without warning. In the confusion, she glanced back at the door, only to see the shadow had vanished. In the following weeks, Emily couldn't shake the image of the shadow. She kept it to herself, chalking it up to stress, a trick of the light, or just her overactive imagination. That is, until she overheard another nurse, Karen, talking about something strange she had seen in room 14. Karen had been checking on a patient who had been slipping in and out of consciousness for days. She described seeing a shadow at the end of the bed, just standing there, watching. Karen had tried to call out to it, thinking it was another nurse, but the figure disappeared. The patient passed away within the hour. Emily's heart raced as she listened to Karen's story, realizing that they had both seen the same figure. Over the next few months, more nurses began to share their experiences, always during the night shift, always near a terminal patient. The shadow appeared without sound, without warning, standing still, watching, just moments before the patient died. The staff started to whisper about the shadow, calling it the grim visitor. Some believed it was an omen, a sign that death was near. Others dismissed it as nothing more than hallucinations caused by exhaustion. Yet, for those who saw it, there was no doubt. Something sinister was lurking in the ICU. Emily's next encounter with the shadow came on a particularly stormy night. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the power had flickered several times. The hospital's emergency lights gave the ICU an eerie glow, casting long shadows across the floor. That night, a young woman named Lisa was in critical condition after a severe car accident. Her family had been by her side for days, but she wasn't expected to survive the night. Emily entered Lisa's room to check on her, already on edge from the storm outside. As she adjusted the IV and checked her vitals, a familiar sensation washed over her. The air felt cold, thick with an oppressive stillness. She looked up and saw it again, the shadow. This time, the figure was clearer. It stood by the window, its form almost blending with the darkness outside, but its presence was undeniable. Emily's hands shook, her breath quickened. She felt as though the figure was staring right through her, even though it had no discernible eyes or face. Suddenly, Lisa's monitors began to beep erratically. The young woman gasped for breath. her body trembling. Emily rushed to help, calling for a doctor. As the medical team worked frantically, Emily glanced back at the shadow. It hadn't moved. It stood there, unmoved by the chaos, as if waiting. Moments later, Lisa's heart stopped. The doctors tried to revive her, but their efforts were futile. She was gone. When Emily looked back, the shadow had disappeared, leaving nothing but an empty room and a cold chill. The sightings continued for several more years, with different nurses all reporting the same shadowy figure in the ICU. The grim visitor never appeared during the day and was never seen by the patients' families, only by the night shift staff. Some of the nurses even claimed that they could feel its presence before they saw it, as if death itself was walking the halls of St. Mary's. By 2008, the hospital underwent a massive renovation, and the ICU was completely remodeled. After the renovations, the sightings of the grim visitor stopped. The new ICU had brighter lights, new equipment, and a more modern design. Yet, despite the cheerful new environment, the nurses who had seen the shadow couldn't forget their experiences. Emily stayed on at St. Mary's for a few more years before transferring to another hospital. She never saw the grim visitor again, but the memories haunted her. She often wondered what it was. Was it truly death? A spirit? Or something else entirely? Some of the nurses believed the ICU's remodeling had disrupted whatever energy had allowed the shadow to appear, but no one could say for sure. What remained was an unsettling truth. Something had been watching, waiting, and appearing only in those final fleeting moments of life. Whether it was a ghost or a symbol of something darker, the shadow's presence left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. And though the ICU no longer hosted the grim visitor, some nurses still whispered about it on quiet, lonely nights, as if afraid to speak its name too loudly, lest it come back once more. Nurse swears she treated a young girl in the ER, but when she checks the records, there is no trace of the patient ever being there. Over time, she uncovers a terrifying past linked to the hospital and the girl. Watch the video till the end to hear the whole story, and subscribe the channel if you haven't subscribed. The ER is always bustling at night. Patients arriving, doctors rushing around, and the constant movement of stretchers. It's a fast-paced environment, but there are moments when the quiet of the night brings with it strange, unexplainable occurrences. Nurse Lisa had been working in the ER for about 5 years. She was accustomed to the responsibilities of the night shift. However, in 2021, something happened on a quiet night that has left her puzzled to this day. That night, the ER was relatively calm. A few patients came in, were treated, and sent home. But around 3 a.m., during the infamous witching hour, a young girl suddenly appeared at the entrance to the ER. She was wearing an old white dress, standing still, with large eyes that seemed to hide a silent story she couldn't speak aloud. Lisa was surprised, as it was unusual for a young girl to be alone in the hospital at that hour. She approached the girl and asked, "What's wrong? How did you get here?" The girl softly replied, "My stomach hurts." Lisa took her inside and laid her down on a bed. The girl's face was pale, and her eyes held a deep sadness. Lisa checked her blood pressure and found it was abnormal. She sent for some blood tests and called for a doctor. The doctor arrived and examined the girl but couldn't determine the exact cause of her pain. The girl lay quietly during the examination, tears occasionally welling up in her eyes, but she didn't speak much. Looking at the doctor, Lisa sensed he had the same feeling, that there was something more to the girl's story. Lisa asked, "Do you want to say something? Should we call someone for you?" The girl slowly whispered, "My mother is coming." Lisa realized the girl's condition was critical. She prepared to transfer her to the ICU. But just then, something strange happened. The girl suddenly sat up and looked directly at Lisa, saying, "Do you know why I'm here?" Surprised, Lisa asked, "No, what do you mean?" The girl whispered, "I died here many years ago." Lisa was stunned. She rushed toward the girl, but by the time she reached her, the girl was unresponsive. The monitor flatlined, and doctors rushed in to perform CPR. Despite their efforts, they couldn't save her. The girl died, just as she had said. Lisa was deeply disturbed by the incident. The next morning, she looked through the hospital records to find details about the girl. But to her surprise, there was no record of the girl from the previous night. In fact, there was no mention of any young girl being admitted to the ER at all. Lisa grew more confused. She checked the hospital's CCTV footage and was shocked to discover that the girl was never seen entering the ER. Yet both Lisa and the doctors had treated her, so where had she come from? Determined to find answers, Lisa spoke to some of the older staff members at the hospital. They revealed a tragic story from 20 years ago. A young girl named Sarah had been brought to the ER one night in critical condition. Her mother had died in an accident, and Sarah had been severely injured. Despite long hours of treatment, the doctors couldn't save her, and she died in the same ER room where Lisa had treated the mysterious girl. Since Sarah's death, there had been occasional reports from hospital staff claiming to see a young girl in the ER, but no one had ever been able to provide proof. Lisa realized she had treated the spirit of Sarah, who had perhaps never found peace after her tragic death. Lisa silently prayed for Sarah and made sure the hospital's old records acknowledged her passing, showing her the respect she deserved. After that night, Lisa never saw the girl again. However, Sarah's face still occasionally flashed before her eyes. Perhaps Sarah had finally found peace and would no longer need to return. It was a stormy night when Dr. Sarah Thompson, a seasoned emergency physician, was called to the old Willow Creek Hospital. The hospital had been in operation since the early 1900s, but had recently been partially closed due to modernization. Only the emergency department and a few remaining wards were still functional. Tonight, Sarah was covering the night shift alone, her colleague unexpectedly falling ill. The rain battered against the windows, and the wind howled through the old corridors. The hospital's dim, flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah's footsteps echoed as she walked through the empty hallways, her only company the distant, occasional beep of medical equipment. As the night wore on, Sarah received a call from the hospital's administration. They had received an emergency alert from a ward that had been closed for years, the old Ward 13. Sarah was puzzled. She knew that area had been shut down due to severe water damage. Nevertheless, she grabbed her flashlight and headed toward the abandoned wing. The hallway leading to Ward 13 was unusually cold, and the temperature dropped even further as she approached. Sarah noticed that the power was out in this section, but the emergency lights were functional. The flickering light cast unsettling shadows on the peeling wallpaper and cracked tiles. She reached Ward 13 and hesitated before pushing open the creaky door. The room was filled with old, dusty beds and tattered curtains. The smell of mildew was overpowering. Sarah's flashlight swept over the room, revealing old medical charts and abandoned equipment. Just then, she heard a faint sound, a weak, labored breathing. Her heart raced as she followed the sound, moving cautiously through the eerie silence. The breathing grew louder as she approached a bed in the corner of the room. To her shock, a figure lay on the bed, covered by a thin, stained sheet. The figure appeared to be an elderly woman, but her face was hidden. Sarah could barely make out her features as the light from her flashlight illuminated the area. Her hand reached out to check for a pulse, but just as she did, the woman's eyes shot open wide, staring blankly. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as the woman's lips moved in a silent scream. The room seemed to grow colder, and the lights flickered more intensely. Sarah stumbled backward, her flashlight casting erratic beams across the room. The woman's eyes remained fixed on her, filled with an indescribable terror. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah fumbled with her flashlight, trying to turn it back on. When the light finally flickered back to life, the woman was gone, and the bed was empty. Panicked, Sarah searched the room, but there was no sign of the elderly woman. She decided it was best to leave the abandoned ward and return to the main hospital. As she turned to leave, she heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable, "Help me." She raced back through the darkened corridors, her mind reeling with the sight she had just witnessed. As she reached the main part of the hospital, she reported the incident to the night shift nurse. The nurse, looking grave, informed her that the woman in Ward 13 had been a patient there many years ago, one who had vanished mysteriously. Her disappearance had never been explained. Sarah left the hospital that night, her nerves frayed. The experience haunted her, and she never spoke of it again. The old Ward 13 remained closed, its dark secrets hidden from the world, a place where the past clung to the present with a grip as cold and unforgiving as the stormy night she had encountered it.